Layne, you had recently put up a video on protein distribution that I'd like to get into. So I do have thoughts on it, and I very well may be trying to confirm my own bias, of course. But maybe you can just kind of give a brief summary of what it showed, and then I can kind of get onto my questions for it.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a very selfish opinion of this because it kind of confirmed one of my studies from my PhD. And also, I was a little bit disappointed that they did not cite my paper, considering it was pretty much dead on the same experiment. I mean, in rats, but you would think they would cite. But hey, I'm not bitter or anything.
Just says in rats, right? I mean, it's a Twitter handle. So yeah, it's perfect.
So anyway, one of the notions that we've had for a while in protein is that there's no storage component for protein. Although I think Stu and I had a debate with a guy on Twitter a while back who was arguing that muscle was a form of storage of protein.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember that. Yeah, that was.
And you were like, that's like saying a house is a storage form of wood.
Yeah,
you don't build a house
bricks,
with that, you're going to break it down.
This house is just a brick holding repository.
Yeah. So there's no real storage, let's say short-term storage form of protein like you have carbohydrate and adipose, where you're able to access those fuels relatively quickly. So protein, the idea is, and as we started to understand leucine and mTOR better, appears to be regulated on a meal-to-meal basis. And so you have a kind of a minimum threshold to where protein synthesis is stimulated. And then you also seem to have a maximum cap. So if that is actually true, you should not really be able to make up for like low protein at one meal by over consuming it at another meal if what we think is true. So I've written about this a lot in my prelim, and then in my thesis. I had it in my introduction, and then Layman right before my last study was like, you keep talking about distribution. If you want to have it in your thesis, you should probably test it. Like, crap. So we did something very similar to the study that was just run, although in rats. We did 11 weeks, and we had rats consume either 30. In one group, they would have 30% of their protein in breakfast and lunch, so 15% at each, and then 70% at evening. And the reason we picked that is there's some data showing that most Americans consume about 60 to 70% of their protein at dinner. And then we had another group that was not quite completely evenly distributed, but was getting more than enough protein and leucine to hit their threshold at all three meals. And we did that for 11 weeks. And what we found was that after that time, the animals who were consuming the evenly distributed protein had bigger muscles in terms of their calf weights and those sorts of things. And we saw a trend for difference in lean body mass. Depending on what you want to put into trends, it is what it is. But it wasn't like a huge difference. People will say, well, I do intermittent fasting and I put on muscle. Well, sure, you can definitely do that. But if we're talking about, optimized, if we're talking about a bodybuilder or a strength athlete, somebody who's really trying to get the absolute most out of things, there was about an 8% difference in the muscle weights. And so is that important for you? Well, it depends on your goals. But a recent study out of a group in Japan, they did a very similar study where they called it more of a high breakfast study. So they had one group that was getting 3 grams of protein at breakfast, another group that was getting 20, and then at lunch it was kind of similar, although the evenly distributed group was getting 30, whereas the unevenly distributed group was getting 20. And then at the dinner meal, the unevenly distributed group was getting 55 grams of protein. And I think it was about 85 to 90 grams of protein between the groups. And actually, the group that was evenly distributed got a little bit less total protein, though it was not statistically significant. And what they found was at the end of it, they showed differences in, I think it was 12 weeks in resistance. They had them resistance trained, but I think they were novices, I want to say. I could be wrong on that. But they did show differences in lean body mass. Didn't really show differences in strength, although there was a trend for leg extension strength to be better in the evenly distributed group. And again, they weren't massive differences in muscle mass, but it was one of those things where it's okay, if you are somebody who just wants to build a little bit of muscle and look better and that sort of thing, does it matter, or can you still make progress without, hitting these thresholds at every meal? Sure, Sure, of course. And I would never say that that's more important than overall adherence. So if something like, for example, intermittent fasting, which would seem to, this study would seem to go against that idea. If intermittent fasting helps you control overall calories and is a viable option for your adherence, then I would say certainly you don't have to do this. But if you ask me, inject me with truth serum and say, do I think that intermittent fasting is the best possible thing you can do if you want to completely optimize every single ounce of muscle? No, I don't. But that doesn't mean it can't be a viable option for a lot of people.
Gotcha. And so I'll give my, full thoughts on it, and Layne, you can either agree or tear me to shreds. So I think, as I read through the study, and first thing I noticed, of course, is, and again, I'm probably taking for granted that when, me, my friends who lift, everybody in this kind of space is pretty on board with the 1 gram per pound of body weight, right? And so we're all eating at least, for most of us, like 200 plus grams of protein. So already you have this study looking at, it goes out to be about 0.6 grams per pound.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of like when we look at like protein quality, right? So if somebody said, hey, I can only have 80 grams of protein in a day, what should I have? Well, then I'd say, okay, you want to look at whey protein, maybe some casein. But if we're eating 250 grams, I think Stu, you had a recent paper on like potato protein, right? Probably,
yes.
And not surprisingly, it increased muscle protein synthesis. And it, even if it's maybe not like the highest quality protein, it'll work, right? And so this study, just that's the first thing I want to point out, is it's a pretty low, relative to what we normally talk about, it's a pretty low amount. And I think that does influence it. I will kind of give my 2-minute story on probably where my bias comes from, where, for the first 8 years of lifting, I was 6-7 meals a day, always, around the clock, constant. I was very hesitant about trying this whole intermittent fasting thing. So my freshman year, still sticking to my traditional methods, I'll say I gained 7 pounds of muscle. And when I say that, what I mean is I was at a certain weight, waistline, calipers. I gained 25 pounds, I cut back down, and I was now 7 pounds heavier at the same exact measurement. So, I think it's a fair estimate.
Lean body mass, yeah.
Yeah. So sophomore year, I said, okay, let me try this intermittent fasting thing, just out of convenience, not because I thought it would be magical or anything. Gained, same thing, went up, went down, because now had gained another 8 pounds when it should be, obviously gains tend to taper off. So now I'm 8 pounds heavier. And I've done this, and I'm like, this is crazy. I'm having 3 meals a day. I don't have to bring protein shakes to the college parties. Like, it was a revelation. And so that was great. And so I at least showed that, like, okay, I literally put 100 pounds on my deadlift that year. So it was great. Now, of course, N equals 1. That anecdote is almost useless, right, in terms of what we're trying to get out here. I'm just explaining that. What's that?
Not for you. It's not useless.
Right. And so, but again, now my protein intake went from 300 grams a day as a 160-pound guy to 200 grams. So still more than enough. But I had, I was following like Dante Trudel, 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, all that stuff, And so I dropped my protein intake. I went to 3 meals a day over an 8-hour time span. Great results. Now, when you talk about things like a lot of times people will say with supplements and everything, well, if you just want to, look okay, then that's fine. But if you want the most out of it, then you got to do this. And to me, I think I get that. When we say the most out of it, I think it's maybe like a couple percentage. It's not, oh, in one, you're going to look decent on the beach, and one, you're going to be a competitive bodybuilder. I really think that for most people, it's almost no difference. And the last kind of point I would make is, did you look at the workout times for this study, Layne?
I don't recall them offhand.
Okay. So about a third of the high protein breakfast participants worked out in the morning. You could do morning or evening session. About half of the low protein breakfast participants worked out in the morning, when they were only having, what'd you say, it's like somewhere between like 5 and 10 grams of protein in their breakfast.
Yeah, actually less than that. I think under 5.
Yeah. So when you think about that, even the people who do intermittent fasting still tend to concentrate their protein around workout sessions. I personally don't know anybody who would say, I'm going to work out and I'm going to have 3 grams of protein, and then I'm not going to have any significant protein for 5 hours, right? So I do think that the timing there was a big difference. And I would have loved to see if everybody had an evening session, how would this have affected it? If everybody worked out when they were either getting evenly distributed, or their biggest protein bolus was at the evening session around their workout. And I would guess that the small difference we saw would become an almost non-existent difference, would be my hypothesis.
So I want Stu's opinion on this, but I'm going to acknowledge some limitations and then also give you some feedback and criticism. So again, my bias is trying to get as jacked as possible. So let's just remember where that is, and that, you know, a 2% difference for me or a competitor is maybe a huge difference in terms of where you place. So I think the first thing is you're absolutely right. If we do high protein studies, like we do 250 grams a day, for example, maybe we see something different. However, I would be interested to see that because, again, if the muscle full effect is correct, and some of these kind of, I don't want to say that they're accepted, but hypotheses that we are relatively confident in terms of protein metabolism, if they are correct, then it should still hold true in terms of so much of the day being without protein. Now, that being said, I think one of the major limitations that people don't really bring up is looking at protein degradation. We know so much less about protein degradation than we do synthesis. And part of that is just because it's so hard to assess and measure. So we just, typically in the protein community, what we kind of do is we measure synthesis and we go, oh, we'll assume degradation's kind of following synthesis, you know? So that is a huge limitation. And maybe that explains, if there ends up being no difference, maybe that explains a big portion of it. Maybe degradation really down ramps during that fasting period, but we don't know. Or at least I haven't seen research on it. I'd love to hear Stu because he looks at it a lot more than I do. But the other thing I would say is that I think what we really underestimate in terms of seeing progress is just how much you like doing the diet and personal preference and adherence. People poo-poo that stuff all the time because it doesn't sound sexy. But if you feel good on a diet, like if you're eating 300 grams of protein a day, if it's 2 grams, you ever tried eating 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight? You feel like crap. You're so full and bloated constantly because you're trying to eat so much volume of food. So even, I mean, again, I'm not trying to dismiss what I'm saying is I totally believe your experience.
Sure.
I just don't necessarily believe it's a physiological outcome so much it is psychological preference. And if you look at some of the studies on the power of suggestion or just our preference, it is amazing how much better people respond to something they feel good about. If you don't feel good about it, you don't respond well to it. There is a, like, having my world open up to looking at studies on placebo itself and the power of suggestion. Mm-hmm. Once I read some of those studies, I looked at some of the other scientific data. I go, we don't know anything. We really don't. We don't know anything. I don't, you know, it just, you know, it's like people ask me about my back rehab because I had several really bad back injuries and I rehabbed, came back, got stronger. People will ask me, well, what did you do? That seemed to work really well. And I'll go, maybe. Right. Or maybe it was just I felt really good about it and that helped me, you know. So we do need to kind of carry out those studies with a little bit more protein, see if it still holds true. And I think we're also going to run into, you know, my study, 11 weeks. That's a significant portion of a rat's lifespan. I think it's almost like an eighth, I want to say. Are we going to be able to, like, and especially when you're looking at human beings, where you can only really get with controlled stuff, you know, especially when you're taking biopsies and that kind of thing, it's tough to get more than 12 weeks. You know what I mean? And you may just not see differences in 12 weeks because there is so much noise when it comes to muscle mass, cross-sectional area. The other thing to talk about is when you're using rats, you have basically, if you get a certain strain of rat, they're kind of genetically homogeneous, whereas human beings are not genetically homogeneous. So you have issues with, hopefully randomization helps, but it creates much more noise in your data, much more noise in your signal. So there's a lot of challenges to hashing that out, and we may never, ever get a clear answer to that. And so again, when I say this is speculating and injecting me with truth serum. That was my opinion, but I could be wrong.